The Second World War witnessed a relentless, often desperate, arms race between armor and anti-armor weaponry. German tank doctrine, honed by the successful campaigns of the Blitzkrieg, initially placed the Wehrmacht far ahead in armored warfare. They possessed some of the most formidable vehicles ever built, vehicles like the Panther and the mighty Tiger. These heavy tanks, with their thick, sloped armor and devastating cannons, projected an air of invincibility across every battlefield. The early Allied responses to this armored superiority were often clumsy, insufficient, or simply overwhelmed by the German engineering advantage. Infantry soldiers, the men on the ground who faced these steel beasts daily, desperately needed a weapon to level this terrifying disparity. They required a portable, reliable, and powerful device that could be carried by one or two men but strike with the force of an artillery piece. Into this deadly vacuum stepped the American rocket launcher M1, quickly nicknamed the Bazooka due to its resemblance to a musical instrument. It was a primitive but revolutionary concept, utilizing the shaped charge principle to defeat thick armor plates. The very first iteration of the bazooka was a product of rushed wartime design, a necessary gamble on a new technology. It represented the dawn of the shoulder-fired rocket age, transforming the battlefield dynamics forever. This weapon system promised to give the average infantryman the ability to destroy the most powerful tanks with a single, well-aimed shot. The initial fielding of this new technology was fraught with technical difficulties, logistical issues, and a steep learning curve for the troops. Its arrival signaled the end of the undisputed reign of the heavy tank, but its full potential was yet to be realized in the field. The story of the bazooka is not just one of invention, but one of rapid wartime refinement under the extreme pressure of combat. In the early years of the conflict, the German army's confidence in its armored divisions was fully justified by the battlefield results. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, while eventually surpassed, were state-of-the-art when they first encountered Allied forces. This confidence grew into a degree of overconfidence, particularly when facing the seemingly inferior equipment of their adversaries. When the M1 bazooka first appeared in North Africa during 1942, the German reaction was predictable, a mixture of curiosity and outright derision. Wehrmacht intelligence reports initially dismissed the weapon as an eccentric, crude, and unreliable American novelty. Tank crews, in particular, viewed the bazooka with contempt, often referring to it with mocking nicknames or simply ignoring it as a serious threat. They focused their fears on Allied anti-tank guns and the heavier cannons of the Sherman tanks they knew so well. The early bazooka rounds, particularly against the frontal armor of the Panzer IV, often failed to penetrate or resulted in non-catastrophic hits. The weapon's reliability issues, including the delicate battery-powered ignition system, contributed to the German belief that it was more a nuisance than a killer. German crews believed their superior training and thick steel plates rendered them immune to what they considered a glorified toy. They had already mastered the art of close-quarters combat against enemy armor using their own formidable cannons and tactics. The sheer mass and intimidating presence of tanks like the Tiger I seemed to dwarf the slim, hollow tube of the American launcher. This early period of contempt was a critical psychological advantage for the German tankers, yet it led to a dangerous underestimation of rocket technology. It allowed the Allies a window of opportunity to dramatically improve the weapon while their opponent remained complacent. The initial bazooka rounds, while shaped charges, were sometimes too small to reliably defeat the thicker German armor post-1943. The early mockery stemmed from a fundamental lack of respect for the infantry's ability to pose a lethal threat to the main battle tank. The official deployment of the rocket launcher M1 was shrouded in operational secrecy, first seeing combat during Operation Torch. This invasion of North Africa in late 1942 was the crucible for the bazooka, its first taste of firing in anger against Axis armor. The M1 was rushed to the front, its doctrine still being written as the troops were learning to operate it in harsh desert conditions. It was a clumsy weapon, a single-piece steel tube nearly 5 feet long, making it cumbersome to transport and difficult to maneuver in tight spaces. The electrical system, which relied on 2 dry-cell batteries, was the bazooka's Achilles heel in the field. These batteries were highly susceptible to extreme temperatures and moisture, often failing when the soldier needed the weapon most. A failed firing meant a potential catastrophic exposure for the infantryman, who was forced to stand and aim the weapon. Despite these significant technical drawbacks, the bazooka achieved moments of shocking success that changed the tactical landscape. Its shaped charge warhead, a revolutionary concept, could indeed defeat armor that was impervious to conventional rifle fire and machine guns. The psychological impact on the German crews, when a tank was successfully disabled by 2 men with a tube, was immediate and unsettling. A heavy tank could be suddenly stopped by a weapon that weighed barely 15 pounds when unloaded. However, the instances of spectacular success were often outweighed by the frustrating instances of misfires and duds. This inconsistency only fueled the German tank crew's initial assessment that the weapon was unreliable and poorly manufactured. The M1's shortcomings were clear, but the fundamental potential of the design was proven in the sands of the Sahara. The Americans quickly realized that a complete overhaul, not just minor tweaks, would be required to create a truly battlefield-ready weapon. The bazooka's earliest moments were a mix of triumph and failure, a flawed prototype showing the way to a new kind of war. German scorn for the M1 bazooka was not merely based on arrogant disdain for American manufacturing, it was rooted in combat experience. Early encounters often resulted in bazooka rounds failing to detonate or striking the thickest parts of the tank armor without effect. The German crews were masters of exploiting enemy weaknesses, and the bazooka's unreliability was a major vulnerability they quickly identified. Tank commanders frequently instructed their crews to ignore the infantry carrying the bazooka unless they were within point-blank range. They knew that a sudden maneuver or a quick burst of machine gun fire would often cause the bazooka team to miss or prematurely abandon their firing position. The large, visible backblast from the M1 was also a major giveaway, instantly revealing the location of the firing team to the tank's gunner. Stories circulated among the Panzer divisions of captured American GIS demonstrating the weapon only to have it fail to fire due to a dead battery. This created a culture of dark humor and dismissive jokes surrounding the supposedly powerful American rocket launcher. They had their own solutions like the Panzerfaust, which was a simple, single-shot, preloaded weapon that required no batteries or complex wiring. The German equivalent, the Panzerschreck, was a direct copy of the bazooka, but its size and powerful warhead immediately made it more respected. The Wehrmacht had quickly grasped the shaped charge technology, but their engineers were appalled by the crude, electrically-fired M1 design. They believed that a weapon intended for armor destruction should not be dependent on a fragile, temperamental power source. The initial mockery was a form of psychological defense, an attempt to minimize a threat that fundamentally changed the dynamic of tank versus infantry. This dangerous laughter would cease abruptly when the bazooka's design flaws were corrected and its true potential was unleashed. The collective German dismissal of the M1 was a strategic blunder rooted in a failure to anticipate the rapid pace of Allied weapons development. They failed to see the M1 not as a finished product, but as a proof of concept for a revolutionary class of weaponry. To understand why the bazooka, even in its flawed M1 form, terrified tank crews, one must grasp the power of the hollow charge. The German term for this technology was holelading, and they were among the first to successfully develop and deploy it. Also known as the shaped charge or high explosive anti-tank, heat, round, its effect is fundamentally different from a conventional shell. Instead of relying on kinetic energy and the sheer mass of the projectile to punch a hole through the armor, it utilizes a chemical effect. The warhead contains an explosive charge mold around a metallic liner, often made of copper. When the projectile impacts the target, the explosive detonates from the rear forward, compressing the liner into a high-velocity jet. This metallic jet is traveling at phenomenal speeds, estimated to be around 20,000 to 30,000 feet per second. This immense speed allows the superplasticized jet of copper to liquefy and pierce even the thickest steel armor plate. The diameter of the hole created is small, but the resulting high-pressure jet causes spalling inside the tank's crew compartment. Spalling releases molten metal and lethal fragments into the crew compartment, instantly destroying equipment and killing the crew. Crucially, the effectiveness of the shaped charge is independent of the speed at which the projectile strikes the target. This meant a relatively slow-moving, unguided rocket could achieve the same penetration as a heavy, high-velocity tank cannon. This principle made it possible for a small, portable weapon to carry the armor-killing power of a much larger artillery piece. It shifted the anti-tank focus from heavy engineering to explosives chemistry, democratizing the power to destroy tanks. The bazooka delivered the power of the hollow charge into the hands of the ordinary foot soldier for the first time in history. The German engineers recognized this potential, which is why their own Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck were developed with urgency. While German tank crews were busy mocking the M1 bazooka, their own infantry was desperately searching for an answer to Allied armor. The result of this search was the rapid development and fielding of two formidable, indigenous anti-tank weapons, the Panzerfaust and the Panzerschreck. The Panzerfaust was a marvel of wartime simplification, a recoilless, single-shot, disposable launcher. It was incredibly cheap to produce and remarkably effective, capable of destroying any Allied tank from the side or rear. Its enormous hollow-charge warhead and simplicity of use made it a deadly threat, even in the hands of poorly trained militia forces. The Panzerschreck, which translates to tank terror, was a more direct response and an undeniable imitation of the American bazooka. Unlike the M1, the Panzerschreck utilized a much larger 88mm rocket, giving it vastly superior penetration power. It was designed with a large blast shield to protect the operator from the rocket's back blast, a necessary safety improvement. The Germans had learned quickly, adopting the shoulder-fired rocket concept but immediately improving the lethality of the warhead. The proliferation of these two German weapons indicated a clear, if begrudging, acceptance of the rocket's revolutionary power. The fact that the Wehrmacht was rushing a copy of the American design into mass production was the truest measure of the bazooka's impact. The Panzerschreck eliminated the M1's unreliable battery system, instead using a simple percussion cap to ignite the rocket motor. This German copy was superior to the American original in many ways, being more powerful, more reliable, and generally better protected for the user. Yet, this only demonstrated the critical nature of the infantry anti-tank weapon in the changing landscape of World War II. The psychological game had shifted. The German infantry was now equipped with weapons that could reliably defeat the best Allied armor. The Americans knew that to keep their own tanks safe and to support their infantry, they needed to leapfrog the German copies with an even better design. The existence of the Panzerschreck served as a stark, undeniable confirmation that the concept of the bazooka was sound. The M1 bazooka's initial problems were not mere technical hiccups, they were fundamental design flaws that jeopardized its users. The dependence on dry cell batteries to generate the firing current was the single greatest point of failure in the entire system. These batteries, similar to those found in a flashlight, would rapidly fail in the cold mud and wet climate of the European battlefield. A dead battery meant a dead weapon, leaving the bazooka team exposed and defenseless against the very tanks they were supposed to be hunting. The single-piece construction of the M1 was also a major logistical headache for the infantry in the field. Its 5-foot length made it extremely difficult to carry through dense terrain, into buildings, or inside the cramped confines of a jeep. The size made it a highly conspicuous target, alerting German crews to the presence of an anti-tank threat from a great distance. The rocket's fins were often damaged during transport and handling, which in turn severely compromised the rocket's flight stability. A wobbly rocket meant a missed shot, and a missed shot meant an enraged tank now knew exactly where to fire its main gun. The electrical circuit was also exposed at the rear of the tube, creating a serious risk of accidental short-circuiting and misfire. American infantrymen were growing increasingly frustrated with the weapon's temperamental nature and battlefield inconsistency. They needed a weapon they could bet their lives on, a launcher that would fire every time the trigger was pulled. The initial mockery from the Wehrmacht, though arrogant, was partially justified by the M1's engineering deficiencies. The need for a two-man crew to operate the cumbersome M1 also added to the complexity and logistical footprint. One man aimed and fired, while the other was responsible for loading the weapon under intense, stressful fire. The battlefield evidence was overwhelming. A radical redesign was needed to transform the bazooka from a flawed novelty into a reliable tank killer. The M9A1 rocket launcher, quickly nicknamed the Super Bazooka, was the direct and decisive American response to the M1's failures. It was a complete re-engineering of the original concept, addressing every major complaint from the men fighting on the front lines. The single most significant change was the abandonment of the unreliable battery-powered ignition system. The M9A1 instead used a magneto, or induction generator, to create the electrical current needed to fire the rocket. This simple, yet brilliant, mechanical solution meant that the weapon would fire reliably in any weather condition, from the Arctic to the desert. The M9A1 was also designed with a crucial innovation, a two-piece, breakdown tube construction. The tube could now be quickly separated into two smaller sections for much easier carrying and transport by the infantryman. This feature immediately solved the logistical nightmare of maneuvering the long, cumbersome single-piece M1 launcher. It also made it possible for a single soldier to carry the weapon more efficiently, though it officially remained a two-man team weapon. The materials were upgraded, replacing the M1 steel with a much lighter and more durable aluminum alloy. This reduction in weight made the weapon less fatiguing for the infantry who had to carry it for miles through rugged terrain. The M9A1 introduced a proper, pistol grip trigger mechanism and a safer, more robust sighting system. The new design also featured a much stronger and more aerodynamic M9 rocket, which reduced the previous problem of in-flight damage. The Super Bazooka was now reliable, portable, and a significantly more dangerous threat to German armor. It was a perfect example of wartime technological iteration, driven by honest, harsh feedback from combat troops. When the M9A1 began arriving in large numbers on the Western Front, the rules of engagement for German tank crews changed forever. This new bazooka arrived just in time to face the desperate, final German counteroffensives, including the massive Battle of the Bulge. The sheer reliability of the induction-powered ignition was a game-changer, eliminating the chance of a misfire in the freezing winter temperatures. Suddenly, American infantry teams could confidently lie in wait, knowing that their one shot was far more likely to fire successfully. The two-piece construction allowed bazooka teams to set up ambushes in tighter, more concealed positions. They could fire from the narrow windows of ruined houses or from dense hedgerows, positions impossible for the longer M1. The German crews, who had been trained to rely on the bazooka's unreliability, were now faced with a consistently lethal threat. The psychological edge that the Panzer crews once held over the infantry quickly began to evaporate under the weight of successful M9A1 attacks. Reports of entire German armored spearheads being stalled by determined bazooka teams became common in Allied battle reports. The M9A1 transformed the infantryman from a mere target into a hunter, capable of stalking and destroying the largest tanks. The weapon's success forced a dramatic change in German armored tactics, requiring tanks to be constantly screened by their own infantry. They could no longer risk a solitary tank advancing without a protective force to eliminate the lurking anti-tank rocket teams. The M9A1's arrival was a brutal and immediate lesson that the days of mocking the American rocket launcher were over. It gave the Allied infantry a feeling of power and equality, knowing that the steel behemoths were no longer invulnerable. The Battle of the Bulge solidified the M9A1's reputation as a reliable and deadly weapon that demanded immediate and serious respect. The dawning reality of the M9A1's lethality struck the Wehrmacht tank crews with a terrifying finality. The previous contempt and dismissiveness were replaced by a cold, calculating fear of the infantryman hiding in the shadows. It was no longer a question of whether the American weapon would fire, but where it would strike the armor. Tank commanders had to contend with the fact that their thickest plates, while impervious to many cannons, were still vulnerable to the heat jet. The M9A1 forced them to adopt new, time-consuming defensive measures to protect their valuable and scarce armored assets. The application of Zimmerit, a specialized anti-magnetic paste, was originally intended to defeat magnetic mines. However, crews quickly realized that the threat now came from a different, far more mobile direction. They began adding improvised forms of spaced armor, such as concrete blocks or spare tracks, to the sides of their tanks. This attempt was an effort to prematurely detonate the shaped charge warhead before it could reach the main steel hull. The sheer desperation of this field modification demonstrated the severe psychological impact of the super bazooka. A single, well-placed M9A1 round could result in the total loss of a highly valuable Panther or Tiger tank and its entire experienced crew. The loss of these heavy tanks created a logistics crisis that the German war machine, already strained, could ill afford. The infantry had found their voice, and it was a loud, explosive boom from a shoulder-fired rocket launcher. German crews were forced to develop extremely cautious urban combat doctrines, where bazooka ambushes were most deadly. They had to treat every window, every hedge, and every ditch as a potential firing point for the now reliable anti-tank weapon. The time for mockery had ended, the time for survival had begun, and the odds were increasingly against the steel giants. The M9A1 bazooka was more than just a new weapon, it was a fundamental shift in the tactical power of the foot soldier. Before its arrival, a soldier's primary defense against a tank was to retreat, call for artillery, or rely on specialized anti-tank units. The infantry was merely a spectator in the duel between armored giants and heavy anti-tank guns. The Super Bazooka gave every squad the organic ability to neutralize an armored threat on its own terms. This new capability greatly simplified the complexities of combined arms combat at the platoon and company level. The morale boost for the infantry was immeasurable, as they no longer felt helpless against the relentless terror of a German tank. A soldier carrying the M9A1 was not just carrying a weapon, but carrying the power of salvation for his comrades. The threat of the bazooka allowed the infantry to maneuver more freely, knowing they had a deterrent against a tank counterattack. It meant they could isolate a tank, flank it, and destroy it without having to wait for supporting armor to arrive. This independence and newfound lethality allowed for a more flexible and aggressive style of advance across the battlefields of Europe. The M9A1 was also instrumental in the eventual adoption of more powerful successors, such as the later 3.5-inch Super Bazooka. It established the doctrine that infantry must always be equipped with a man-portable weapon capable of destroying the heaviest armor. This legacy would continue into the Korean War and all subsequent conflicts, making the shoulder-fired rocket a staple of modern warfare. The small, two-man team with their detachable tube had become a greater concern to the panzer crews than entire battalions of medium tanks. The transformation was complete. The infantryman had been fully empowered to take on the armored behemoths of the Wehrmacht. The story of the M1 bazooka's evolution into the devastating M9A1 is a microcosm of the entire Second World War. It is a tale of initial failure, urgent redesign, and the rapid leapfrogging of enemy technology under the pressure of survival. The weapon's ultimate success validated the shaped charge principle as the defining innovation in anti-armor warfare for the next half-century. The heat warhead's legacy is evident in nearly every post-war conflict, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of the Middle East. Modern rocket-propelled grenades, or RPGs, are the direct and undeniable descendants of the original American bazooka design. The concept remains the same, a small, portable projectile that uses explosives chemistry, not raw velocity, to defeat thick steel. The German tank crew's initial derision of the crude M1 was a moment of tactical myopia, a failure to look past the flaws to the revolutionary potential. That laughter was effectively silenced by the M9A1, a weapon that was reliable, portable, and highly lethal in the hands of a determined infantryman. The M9A1 permanently altered the balance of power between the tank and the foot soldier, a balance that the tank has never fully recovered. No longer could a crew feel truly secure behind layers of steel, knowing a single enemy grunt with a tube could end their mission and their lives. The bazooka, in its refined form, ushered in an era where the battlefield dominance of a tank could be challenged by a single infantry team. It was a crucial step in the long, ongoing evolution of warfare that continues to this very day. The M9A1 remains a foundational piece of military history, a symbol of innovation born from the desperate need to fight back. Its final legacy is the continued empowerment of the soldier, proving that size and simplicity can often defeat sheer armored mass.